Gina lost the, all right. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire for the first in our series of conversation entitled The Black Matter is Life, Poetry for Engagement and Overcoming, where we will explore and discuss the rich tradition and innovation found in African American poetry. Why poetry, you may ask? At this time in our country, when we seem to be more divided along our color line, the Black Heritage Trail wanted to present a series of programs that would serve as a bridge of understanding and of healing. And through the creative use of language, its melodious tones, the poets have shown us their moments of joys, challenges, and our own vulnerabilities through their words. The poet helps to shape meaning into what it means to be human. It creates a connection and a shared emotional experience. And we thought that this connection, this sharing, this understanding, this humanness would be a great way for us to dialogue around issues that may sometimes divide us. And we don't know much. We thought this would be a great platform to introduce our communities to some little known or well-known African-American poets. And therefore, this program came to light. Explores how Black poets have used, elaborated on, transformed, and improvised on a Eurocentric poetic tradition. Before we start our program, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. I want to let everybody know that this event is going to be recorded, and we have someone from New Hampshire Public Radio who is also recording this event for possible broadcast on New Hampshire Public Radio. So if there's an issue, if you don't want to be recorded, you can just mute yourself. I'm going to pass this over to our office manager, Gina, to just give us some housekeeping on how we are going to do, how the program will proceed tonight on the technical side. Gina?
Hi, everyone. Give me just a second. Spotlight myself here for you. Thanks for coming. I think Jerian already said this, but I will just give you a little reminder. If you could all please keep yourselves muted until the question and comment portion at the end, we would appreciate it. Also, if you have any questions or technical problems or technical questions, if you could use the chat on the side of your screen. I have a little note in there already that if you have any technical questions, use the chat. And if you could preface your questions with the letters IT, that will be what our IT team is looking for as far as technical questions are concerned. Or you could also email me at info@blackheritagetrailnh.org, but we will see it faster if you put your question in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gina. Any other questions? We have folks on in our back room, so to speak, helping out with technical issues. So to get started, to begin our exploration tonight, we have our conversations will be facilitated by Professors Reginald Wilburn and Dennis Britton, both from UNH. And without much ado, I'm just going to pass the program right over to them so we can get started.
Thank you, Jerry Ann. Hello, Dennis, how are you?
I'm doing very well. How you doing, Reggie?
All right, it's good to see you. And certainly happy to be here with this virtual community to talk about African-American poetry and the richness of its tradition. What our audience would not know is that you and I have been in conversation as Shakespeareans and Miltonists, respectively. I think one of our more dynamic conversations centers around being African-American, loving Shakespeare and Milton respectively, but in as much as we love them, they don't do for us what our Black poets do for us. And so I think to have this opportunity to discuss African-American poetry would really be illuminating and edifying, not just for the two of us, but certainly for our public. So I don't know, maybe just as a refresher, a little background context, you know, what is it about Shakespeare that turns you on? Like, why are you so excited about Shakespeare as an African-American?
Yeah, so it's interesting question, right? And as you said, we've been talking about this for a little bit. So, and the audience may not know, that actually my full-time job is teaching Shakespeare. And for me, my interest in Shakespeare really began in the ways in which he told familiar stories through poetry, right? The stories themselves are usually quite conventional. Boy meets girl, girl meets boy. Parents don't want boy and girl to be together. They get over it somehow and they live happily ever after, right? Comedies, tragedies, some sort of conflict between two people, everybody's dead at the end. So the stories themselves are quite conventional, but through the creation of compelling characters, right? Characters who are very complex and full of contradictions, but also Shakespeare writes his plays in poetry itself. So it's the combination of the characters and the poetry. And that's all poetry does, right? Poetry sort of requires stopping, thinking, meditating, and being like, what does it mean to put it that way and not some other way? How does that particular turn of phrase, or those particular choices of words or images speak to something that might be beyond the surface? And that's when I sort of began to see that in Shakespeare. I'm like, okay, I think I might have something I want to, keep exploring here in my career. And you, sir, you're all about that epic poet John Milton. So what's that all about?
Yeah, well, I think the English language has always been something that I've cherished. I think I come from a family for whom language means a lot. And so when you encounter someone like Milton who can craft a 20, 30 line sentence and it be correct and sublime and beautiful, like that naturally captures my attention. But I think Milton also has this aura of what I call uppity. I've just recently written an article about getting uppity with Milton, or because my mom politely asked, was Milton a racist? But it dawned on me that, right, in some ways, Milton is uppity too. He's uppity in the sense that he was just bad enough to take every genre of poetry that existed and believed he was bad enough to not only do it and surpass it, but surpass it in excellence by putting his own stamp of originality on it. So like when Milton writes an epic, it's unlike any other epic that's been done before, and it's brilliant, right? When he writes an ode, when he writes a lyric, when he writes a sonnet, he knows and masters the convention, but he turns it on its head and makes it far more sublime than the best poets in Western tradition and Greek and Roman civilizations. So I think that speaks to me, that resonance of being bad enough to take on tradition and convention and exceed it. And then finally, I think because he's England's Christian and epic poet of liberty, you will always find the theme of liberty throughout his canon, whether it's his political tracts or whether it's his poetry, you're always going to find that concept of liberty. And so I think as an African-American who grew up in a certain point in history, who knew the stories about Jim Crow America, right? My parents grew up in that experience. I remember the videos of, what was the documentary, Eyes on the Prize, right? We always knew Martin Luther King Jr. So that James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud, right? All of those resonances of liberty, I think, those are liberty speeches. And so I think Milton speaks to me on that level. Sadly, he has some British Africanisms that, kind of hating on Blackness. And so that poses other problems. But I think as a literary specialist who is bad with Christianity and Christian poetry and political statesmanship and in elocution and eloquence, like he's just the triple threat.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, Shakespeare has his issues too. So don't give. They definitely got their issues. But what you were saying about being bad, right? For me, that's why, and we've also been talking about this in our sort of conversations about, although we love Milton, although we may love Shakespeare, we don't love them the way we love African American poetry, right?
Yeah.
You know, like this, you know, this pays my bills. Shakespeare pays my bills. African American poetry feeds my soul. It sort of feeds me. You know, it's intellectual. It stimulates the mind. It touches the heart. But it feeds the soul, right? I think, you know, when you're having a bad day, you know, I don't turn to Shakespeare when I'm having a bad day, right? You know, you know, well, you know, I'm probably gonna pray. I'm talk to my mama, and then I'm gonna read some poetry, right? So it has a completely different function. And for me, it's, you know, it's also it's wrapped up in the language, right? You know, just the ways in which the language embraces you, enfolds you. The language talks the way my family talks. The images are the images that my family use.
Yes.
Right. So there's a way in which the poetry is in conversation with me and my family and my aunts, my uncles, my grandparents. Right. It's, you know, and even, you know, we'll talk about Sonia Sanchez later, right? You know, that's hard stuff, right? You know, she's, you know, but even in the sort of even in the more difficult, quote unquote, difficult poems, right? You still kind of feel like this poem is speaking, right? From a, you know, even if I don't always understand it, it's speaking from a place that is central or core to who I am.
Yeah. I think what I'm getting from what you're sharing is like, I always feel centered when I'm reading African American poetry, right? Or anything in the literary tradition. I feel whoever's addressing me, I feel I know them. If I don't know them personally, I know the cadence of their speech. I know the rhythms of their meter. I know if they're hearkening, if they're signifying on a spiritual, I pick it up, I catch it. You know, thinking about the women in my life, the role that African American women have played in my life, right? The sass, the verve, the mother wit, the revolutionary intellect, the leadership. When a Black woman speaks, like, it is unlike any other woman. It's unlike any other voice. And when you hear that appropriated in Black poetry, it takes you back to your mother tongue, right? And by mother tongue, I mean, we've been touched by our mothers, Hortense Spillers would say, right? And, you know, it's mama's baby, but it's papa's maybe, but it's always mama's baby. And we've been touched by her in ways that when you hear the cadence, when you hear the resonance, it's just so familiar, right? The logic that comes with that, you know, you were talking about the scraps of setting, right? The moments where we licked the cake batter from the bowl, right? You know, of our grandmothers, right? To see that imagery play out in the poetry, right? You feel centered, you feel that you know that. I never really feel that with Milton. I don't believe Milton is necessarily talking to me, in as much as I love him. I don't feel that familiarity, that cultural familiarity, that he's, you know, I feel Paul Laurence Dunbar is skin folk and kinfolk, right?
Right.
And I think that means something. And so when you're talking about what the language does for you in times of distress, I think they're speaking in tones that are so familiar, right? The Black church experience, right? It's the Black sermonic, there's a certain gesture. For me, the uppityness of doing things your own way, right? The Black arts poets were just like these visionaries who were like, you know what, to hell with Shakespeare and Milton and this white tradition, we're gonna do our own thing. Like, you can create a poem that's comprised of nothing more than cuss words, right? Like, how bad is that? And for it to pass off as poetry, and to understand that the arrangement of those words, just one word articulated 45 times, is a poem. Like, that's a bad gesture, right? That's the rebelliousness, that's the uppityness of Black folk who have remastered language and made it their own and can make it do what they needed to do.
Yes. I mean, I love that, the remastering and the remixing, maybe, right? Of language, and the ways in which, you know, that's what our parents did, that's what our grandparents did, that's what our great, right? We've always sort of, you know, used the language in a way that spoke to us, right? And if the language itself couldn't do what we needed to do, we found a way to make it do it, right? I was just, as I was preparing for this, and when your words just now were making me thinking about just all the little turns of phrases, right? That you sort of grew up hearing.
Yes.
And it's a both, at home, but also in the church, right? And I wouldn't have thought about it. I just remembered this, just before this, thinking about tonight, in the ways in which, we've always spoken poetry, right? My uncle, whenever he was excited, he would say, "Great day in the morning."
Yes.
Right? You probably heard that phrase too. And like, what like, that's not, yeah, woo, or but the ways in which just that phrase, right, signifies so heavily on African American experience, right, all the way back to slavery, right?
Yeah.
Like it was night, but but my numbers came in, or whatever the case might have been.
Right.
Now it's morning, right?
Yeah.
I've sort of crossed on over to glory, right? But just phrases like that, like, and we knew exactly what he meant.
Yes.
When he said that, right?
Yes.
We knew that was a sign of excitement, but but behind that phrase is an entire history.
Yeah, right.
And I feel like that's, it's that way in which we use language, right? That it sort of speaks now, but it's speaking across time.
Yeah.
At the same time.
And so for me, what you're saying, right? And do we know to recognize that history as sacred, right? As something worthy to be honored? Imagine if that remastery or remixing of language is lost to the younger generations. What is lost in African American culture? Right? If we ever lose the spirit of those words, and of course, language will always sort of, because that's just who we are, we will always repolish language. But I think there's something about honoring the history of these phrases. My grandmother had this phrase of, say nothing and saw wood, right? And the moment that I found that in a Pauline Hopkins text, it was like, wait a minute, that's my grandmother, right? But what does it mean? First of all, that's mother wit and knowledge, that phrase, if you know what it means, right? But if the younger generations lose that, right, what is lost in the name of African American culture? And how many different poetic phrases and poetic terms and poetic ruptures might be lost if we live in a culture that says poetry, smoetry, right? That's just something da-da-da-da-da-da. But it seems to me that the language is an anchor, right? It's a historical anchor, and it's worthy to be savored and saved for the preservation of who we are as a misrepresented people in white colonialist language, right? A language that can call us nigger, right? That has all of these words, a wench for African American women, right? That language, we were stripped of our native languages, right? Had to speak this language that was foisted on us, but we couldn't make it do. Right? We couldn't, it's almost like Black religion, right? White Christianity couldn't work for us, so we had to polish it, right? And so I think this language thing that we do is a variation on that, because that language dehumanizes us from Jump Street.
Yes, most definitely. How are there any particular, how does that sort of inform the way you're thinking about the poems we've read for tonight, or any of them, or just our?
Oh my. Well, it struck me while thinking about, I think we see the resonances of uppityness in all of them. I think about Phyllis Wheatley, right? The poem on imagination. And to me, just starting with that one, maybe we could just start talking about that one, right? For me, that's like a defense of poesy, right? It's a defense of poetry. This Black woman, who was really a teenager, right, had recently been speaking an African language, is enslaved in Boston as a domestic slave, forced to learn English, and somehow she masters English and is writing poetry on the level of Pope, right? Alexander Pope, right? And then what she does with that. I mean, when I teach her, my 21st century students are mystified. They don't understand what she's talking about, right? And so for this teenage Black woman, only recently learning the English language and is now writing couplets like Pope, the fact that she is confounding my 21st century white students, right? I think that's political in and of itself, right? And so, but she's also in that poem, she's talking about the flights of the imaginative fancy of a Black girl enslaved, right? And I think she's laying out a template for how do we think about the moment of Black folk writing poetry in English, the language that's oppressing them.
Yes, 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 yes. I mean, I love that idea. This is why poetry matters. I think back to this over theme, right? And this is why the imagination matters, and this is also why it's worth putting down and documenting it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
For future generations to read and to engage, right? That she found freedom through the poem, right? Through the imagination, through fancy, right? And this is why poetry is. This is why the sort of creative act of creating poems, right, is needed and necessary. Like it's liberatory in and of itself, right? Like when we were, we cheated and we talked about the poems for tonight, but I love all the soaring imagery in the poetry, in the poem. Right? We all stuck on Earth, but her mind is free, right?
Yeah.
And that's what, and I feel like that's what poetry does, right? It allows us to free our minds, right? The poet, she's free, and through reading her, we're freer too.
I'm curious, I use that word, I was trying to bait you. I'm gonna make myself more explicit, but I was very intentional around thinking about on imagination as Wheatley's defense on poesy, right? I'm curious, how does that phrase resonate for you as, that's coming straight out of Sydney, right?
Right.
Another Renaissance poet. Who is famous for his defense of poesy, right? Which is this treatise on the value of poetry as understood in the 16th century, or the 17th century, in the 17th century, around this language that is, at that time, was like Ebonics, right? Or, African-American vernacular English, right? You would not dare speak English, right? And so what's interesting about that moment of the Renaissance is this is where English is showing off its skill. English culture is showing off its language as something worthy to be compared to Greek and Latin. And so to think about Wheatley a century later, now sort of in this one poem, pretty much setting up a defense of poesy, I'm wondering what resonates for you as an early modern scholar.
Yeah. So Sir Philip Sidney writes a defense of poetry, and his whole thing is that poetry is not a waste of time, right? Because first of all, he's a man of the court, and some would say you would be better off doing political military action. But he says no, poetry is an exalted art form, and he says the poet is like God, right? The poet is the maker. Right, the poet can bring forth things into the world that do not already exist, right? And it talks about biblical poets, right? And I think that's exactly what we see, poet as maker, poet as divine office, right? Poet is bringing things into the world that are not yet there, right? That's exactly what Wheatley is doing there, right? In that moment. Right.
Especially in that first stanza, right? Thy various works, imperial queen we are, how bright their forms, how decked with pomp by thee. Thy wondrous acts in beauteous order stand, and all attest how potent is thine hand, right? And then, you have the phrases of the sacred choir, right? And the silken fetters all the senses bind, right? This imperial palace of the thundering God, we on thy pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind, right? So I think, even this appeal to the muses and this sort of staying up in the stratosphere of the celestial gods, she's claiming that fire, right? That celestial fire.
Yes, she most definitely is. She most definitely is. So, this might be a good time to introduce our poet, right? Since we've been talking about poets and what poets do and their ability to make and create and bring things into being that are no longer that are not yet in the world. It might be time to introduce our featured guest for tonight, and we are honored to welcome Lynne Thompson, who is the author of "Start with a Small Guitar" and "Beg No Pardon." Excuse me, sorry, having weird technical difficulties. All right. So she is the author of "Start with a Small Guitar" and "Beg No Pardon," which was the winner of the Perugia Book Award and the Great Lakes College New Writers Award. In 2018, Jane Hirschfield selected her 2019 manuscript, Fretwork, as the winner of the Marsh Hawk Poetry Prize. Thompson is the recipient of multiple awards, among them the Individual Art Fellowship from the City of Los Angeles, a Tuscan Literary Award, and a finalist nod from the Dericote Edie Chapbook Prize. She is also a Pushcart Prize nominee, and that's a really, 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 really major one. Her most recent work appears or is forthcoming in Ninth Letter, December, and 2020's Best American Poetry. Thompson also serves on the boards of Cayman and the Los Angeles Review of Books, and she is chair of the Board of Trustees at her alma mater, Scripps College. And it is our pleasure to now hear from Lynne Thompson. So thank you, Lynne, for joining us tonight.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. I could listen to the two of you for hours. The college I went to, Scripps College, was all about Milton and Shakespeare. So this really resonates with me, and it's just wonderful to be here. You know, I couldn't help but think as you were talking about this resonance of language and how we recognize it. I could hear my mom, who's no longer with us, but very much with us, when I say to the kids in my family, don't make me come down there. And they said, right. You sound just like Grammy. I said, well, you know, what can I tell you? She's never far away, right? So it is that language, despite the beauty of Milton and Shakespeare, and with all due respect to them, this whole idea of the theme of liberty, I felt like, who better to discuss it than African Americans? Yes. And when we bring our music and our cadence to it, which was so great about the Paul Laurence Dunbar poem. Yes. I mean, that's what resonates. That's what's underlying so much of culture in America, period. Not just African American culture, but all culture. And so we take these European tropes and make them our own. So I was thinking, even like with the sonnet of Terrence Hayes's American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin, where he just says, okay, yes, I'm going to take that sonnet, but I'm going to make it my own. At the same time that he stands on the ancestors, credits Wanda Coleman, a Los Angeles poet, I'm proud to say, as pushing him in that direction. So it strikes me with all of these, how much work they're doing at once. Oh, hi, Gail, that went to Scripps College. How much work they're doing on so many levels. So I had written some notes looking at Sonia Sanchez. She's saying, I'm going to take this haiku and tanka and make it my own. I don't care about the Japanese 5-7-5 count. I'm going to do with this as I want to do. And what that's doing is empowering the poets that come behind her. Sonia Sanchez, Mama Sonia, for those of us who have come behind her and said, oh, I don't have to do it the way that, first of all, the Japanese don't always do it that way, but the way that I was taught in 7th grade, make it your own. The first poet I ever saw live, young African-American, was Jane Cortez. And when I saw her work on the page, I said, but she hasn't used any punctuation. Okay, I guess, I mean, she's got a book, so it must be okay. So this idea of permission is built into so much of what we're reading in these poems. So I just thought that note about that. The other thing that struck me was how slyly Sanchez fed in history, this reference to the freedom quilt. And she doesn't make a big deal about it. She doesn't linger on it, but you know that freedom quilt is important. And that shows up in a lot of these poems in terms of how do we put in our history with the things of our history, the grass baskets of South Carolina, the foods, the music is kind of an obvious one, and we can spend some time talking about that. But I liked in all of these how there were these very subtle references. And I know from time to time I take a fair number of workshops to make sure I keep my craft sharp. And my non-African colleagues will say, well, shouldn't you put a footnote to say what X means? And I said, so let me ask you this. When you do a poem and you're referencing Modigliani, you don't say, and Modigliani was born. If I want to know about Modigliani, I have to go look it up. Look it up. And I think that's what happened, for example, after the George Floyd incident, and people had started to watch that program about Tulsa. Yes. And a lot of non-African Americans are saying, how is that possible? How do I not know that? I said, you don't get to write the books. I said, and that's why it's so important to have, in my opinion, African-American poets in particular, but all African-American writers, because we're telling the stories that were kept out of the history book. And the poets love to do that. The music, I mean, in Dunbar's When Malindy Sings, it's not just what she's singing, it's how she's singing it. Yes. So you're taking it in a particular way that if he had written it not in dialect, it wouldn't have the resonance, I don't think, that it has. Even though it may be difficult for a 21st century reader to read it and make sure they understand what's going on, but the light goes off. It's not just when she sings, but how she sings it that is so resonant. And the other thing I wanted to talk about was the geography in the Langston Hughes poems. My dad was a closet poet and read Langston Hughes all the time. So I really kind of came to poetry through that. And the importance of place for the African-American community, always trying to figure out, where did I come from? Where did I live and that wasn't mine, that I didn't own? And Hughes is really good at always doing that. I mean, the one poem is called Harlem, so you're completely put in a context in that poem. And then in the theme for English B, the references to the streets, the cities, not only Winston-Salem, but he has St. Nicholas, 8th and 7th Avenues. So you're really, really saying, where is my community? Yes. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What do we hope our community will look like? So those were just some of the thoughts that I had jotted down as I went through this. And your audience is very lucky if you're not familiar with some of these poems or poets to have this group of poems.
Well, I'm so thankful that you talked about the Dunbar poem and the dialect, because going back to Dennis and my earlier conversation, a discussion, right? How much is lost if we ever lose that native tongue of dialect, right? A Black dialect, right? And for me, and then as you're thinking about the mention of Winston and Salem, what came to me was that's an intertext of the Great Migration.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So that he found it important to name Winston-Salem while he is attending the school in New York City. That's an intertext of the Great Migration. And if we don't know the importance of that history, right?
Absolutely.
You want to understand how the Black vote turned out Milwaukee, right? Turned out Detroit, Philadelphia, right? Atlanta's its own separate thing. But those three, it's because of the Great Migration. And that is documented in the poem.
And for me, as the child of West Indians, I didn't wear my I'm a daughter of immigrants t-shirt. I was going to do that. But to talk about the influence of the West Indian culture in America and that particular migration, which is part of what my book Fretwork is about. I was always fascinated with my parents coming here, like most immigrants, with little or nothing, but believing that there was something they could build here, and the impact that has had for them and all the thousands of others who came from all over the West Indies was really amazing.
Yeah. Dennis, what about you? I mean, I know we would love to have Lynn read some poetry, but Dennis, would you have any comments on this thus far?
Yeah, I loved your comments, and this might be a good place for you to move into your own poetry, but I loved your comment about Sonia Sanchez and the ways in which she opens up space for others.
Absolutely.
I think that's what the tradition is all about, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
And, that she's working within a tradition, right? And I think all of these poets are working within a tradition.
Absolutely.
Like as Reggie said, Wheatley is writing in rhyme couplets, in the style of the day, right? And
right.
you mentioned, sonneteers, and Sanchez is writing in haiku and Tanka. But there's always, I feel like there's always this sort of bi-directional, right? You're like looking back, but you're also looking forward at the same time.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. And leaving, I think of it as leaving breadcrumbs. And I have a very large family and 4 older brothers who were less interested in history than I was. So it's fascinating to me now that the little ones come and say, Auntie Lynn, where is that island that Grammy was from? They want to know. It's kind of skipped a generation and they want to know what's all this about. So that's part of my motivation with the poems that I write.
So I see someone has written, someone wants to know, what does signifying in African-American culture mean? And, it's really, it's been going on long before Skip Gates, but Skip Gates really sort of gives it like theoretical legs as theory.
Absolutely.
And so, real simply, signifying is like the dozens, right? Signifying is this way that Black folk and Black culture, you signify on the preceding comment. But when you signify on it, which is to copy it or to reference it or to allude to it, you're never really copying for the sake of imitation. The goal is to elevate the discourse to make you look bigger. And so the most basic example of signifying is the your mama jokes, your mama's so big, right? Your mama's so big, ... Well, the person who comes behind that, right, they're insulted. They've got to elevate the level of insult.
Exactly.
So they have to repeat the phrase, your mama. But what I think is interesting, right, in terms of Black folk and their vocal swagger, you don't come back and say your mama, you say your mama's so big, right? So you hear the tonal inflection, which is elevating the discourse. And then whatever comes after that, the insult, and if it's effective, it's supposed to topple the preceding one. And so it's this continual back and forth, the signifying monkey as this figure, this trickster figure with language, who understands that the way that the system is set up, right? The monkey is always subject to the lion, but not necessarily so, because the monkey is far more cunning and smarter and intelligent than the lion. And so the signifying monkey can get the best of the lion through cunning and intellectual wit. And we see that in Black verbal expression and culture all the time. That's how we got over, right? When we hear you saying how I got over, there's certainly the spiritual resonance, but a lot of it also too was the intellect and the linguistic intellect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great explanation. I'm glad this is being taped because I'm going to use that.
We would love to hear some poetry from you.
So I sent you a bunch, but I think I have time maybe for 3. This is one that I think is in that signifying tradition. I very much like to cite the poets that have influenced me. So this poem is about Robert Johnson, who some of you in the audience may know that legend. He was a blues guitarist who is alleged to have sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads in order to learn to play a mean guitar. So this poem has an epigraph from Quincy Troup, another fine poet and editor. You begin with a sound wrapped around a syllable, Highway 61 blues. Won't you take me, Bobby J? Won't you take me up the trail out of New Orleans, past Natchez, past Vicksburg, all the way to Rolling Fork? You and me gonna beat the boll weevil, gonna beat the bent back heat all the way to Duncan, all the way to New Africa been on my mind. I'm looking for a blue devil to set me free from floodplains, from Yazoo, from Tallahatchie, fly free me all the way to Greenville, Tutwiler, all the way to Clarksdale, where my guitar just got a moan preaching blue, all the way, all the way, all the way. And I'm hollering loud. I've been buked and scorned, Willie Brown. I've been beat down, howling wolf. Hey, Kid Bailey, got any scratch? Can you get me to Shelby where blues ain't dead? So said some pretty one-eyed gal who gave me 2 6-stringers and a hard drum, said, pace yourself. Pace yourself. And yeah, Mr. Jimmy Cotton soothed me sure with some sweet, sweet devil music to keep me moving out of sullen heat and deep blue and Jim Crow and sharecrop. No more dry throat, no more hot whip, No mammy sold to don't know where, no white man's cotton, but no 40 acres and no goddamn mule. Yeah, so take me, Bobby J, all the way to Memphis, out west to Houston, up east to Cincinnati, up north to Chi-Town, away from the won't you please stop breaking down blues.
Better preach, Lynn.
So that was my effort to praise him, make sure people didn't forget him, to talk about this path that he took. Like we were talking about, you know, the Black migration, which is so integral to so much of Black literature, poetry in particular. So that was my effort to do that. And then I'm trying to make sure I'm mindful of time. I think I'll just read one more, which is my haiku. And it admits up front that it's not a traditional haiku. The title is Haiku, More or Less for West Indian Palates. Curried goat spice, saute and simmer, to dinner sit ye down. Guinea corn, sorghum, rub ye teeth to make 'em clean, sorghum, guinea corn. Curry blend, cumin, allspice, paprika, and dark honey. Filet powder from the Gulf Coast, dried, ground, put into gumbo. Stamp and go. Salt, cod cakes, take me down to Kingstown, take me back to home. Mashed bananas, see Gibbons Bay. Cook a fiery stew, serve hot, sweet. Plantain, do not peel. Cut halfwise, brush with oil, grill or broil. 6 pig's ears, 6 small rolls, mustardy cabbage, spicy sauce. Serve at once.
And the vocal swagger, there's so much vocal swagger, the history, the preserving of history and of recipes, right? The gender politics of that, right? That's Mama's Kitchen, right?
Exactly.
And how much is conveyed, right?
Right.
In the reading and in the poem, right?
Right. Right. I've had people tell me, please don't make me read Lynn's poems out loud because they don't sound right. And I said, okay, so that's the goal, is to convey a particular voice and a particular sound, which all of these poems that you've given to your participants really convey a particular sound. I don't know if they can be posted. I'm not doing the technical part, so I'll leave that to others.
But you know, this is, you know, one of the things that was interesting to me in listening to the 2 poems you've just recited is definitely how they are very much in relationship to the theme of signifying, right? I'm teaching an African American music as literature course this semester, and I'm curious, the first poem, like, you know, you have that phrase, buked and I've been scorned, right? Which of course is a Negro spiritual. And it's like, oh, I would love for my students to read that poem because I think that they would get some delight in recognizing, oh, that's an illusion, right? That's signifying, right? And we've been talking about it. But now that they could read your poem now, and understand that in the midst of all of the other signifying that's going on, they could definitely see how the Negro spiritual is rooted in that.
Absolutely, and for me, that's the goal. I'm not going to read it all, but I referenced that just 2 lines that Sonia Sanchez had about the quilt. And so when I wrote my own Harriet Tubman poem, and frankly wasn't thinking about Sanchez's poem, I had to put in there about the countless quilts along the way, their patterns staring us north by stitch. Shoe fly, log cabin, bear's paw, wagon wheel, sweet swinging from porticos in Dover, in Smyrna, and Odessa, are field guides to the Choptank River, a cipher of bedclothes draped for an uppity Moses, oh sweet chariot. So that uppity thing, it's always there, either explicitly or somehow, you know, imbues the whole poem.
Dennis, you want to say something? I see someone is asking a question. They want us to talk more about the dialect in Dunbar.
Yeah. Well, that might be an interesting connection between, you know, the accent you just read it, right? And thinking about, you know, the particularities of voice, right? And of course, there are different ways to articulate or sort of, for this, to sort of present voice in a poem. And I think, you earlier said about Dunbar, right? And we probably could ask, the same thing about your haiku you just read for us. It's not just what is said, it's about the way it's said.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And, I'm pulling up my Dunbar poem right now, just so I can sort of look at it, and then to what extent does any of it.
While you're looking, if I can just maybe read a couple of stanzas.
Oh, go ahead, read. All right, go ahead.
Like,
Please
Ron, quit that noise, Miss Lucy. Put that music book away. What's the use to keep on trying if you practice till you're gray? You can't start no notes are flying like the ones that Ransom rings from the kitchen to the big woods when Malindy sings. You ain't got the natural organs for to make the sound come right. You ain't got the turns and twistings for to make it sweet and light. Tell you one thing now, Miss Lucy, and I'm telling you for true, when it comes to right singing, tain't no easy thing to do.
Yes, thank you. I have to say, my favorite line, you ain't got the natural organ.
Right. And it's funny
line.
how that, the sound of it, if you close your eyes and you listen to rap, you can see the progression, of language. And, so a young person might say, oh, that's so original. Well, it's original, but it's based in a very particular history. And you can hear it, the line from this to that.
Oh,
Definitely.
Yeah, the rhythm and the words, right? Yeah, yes. Like, rap music is not disconnected from this tradition.
It's not disconnected. That's correct.
And I like that line, right? You ain't got the natural organs, right? And how Dunbar, right? To get back to the audience member's question, right? How the vernacular poetry, right? The dialect poetry of Dunbar is really making a case, right, for organic intellectual activity, right? There's a way, this is the language of our great-grandparents, our grandparents, sometimes it could be our siblings, right? And there's a way in which if we are so beholden to Miltonic English, right, to Shakespearean English, you'd be talking about people's parents, right?
Exactly.
And what I love about this poem is it's putting front and center. You got all that book learning, but really anybody can read a note. If you've been taught how to read music, anyone could do that and produce the mimicry sound. But to not have the intellect, the so-called intellect, to read music notes, and then for your voice to carry to the woods, such that the persona is like, can you make them children be still? Because it's interfering with her voice is carrying across the distance. And even the children's activity is distracting to the melodious intellect of, Malindy, right? And so I think that there's this interesting case being made about native talent as intellect and dialect and Black speech, Black vernacular speech as being a vehicle of a different type. It's organic intellectualism.
Yeah.
And that's what's so amazing, that the other side of that coin is Phyllis Wheatley, who you can deny me learning. You can tell me I can't learn to read. I'm going to be put in prison if I write, and I'll write it better than you write it. So it's that audacity of her that I think was just like, wasn't there a trial or something? So she had to prove that she had written it because they said someone else, she could not possibly have written it.
That's right.
So that's the other side of that coin. We speak our language.
Yes.
And that's good, but we can speak like you if you need us to.
We can do it all, right?
We can do the whole thing. We can do the whole thing.
I'm every woman, it's all in me.
It's all in me. Exactly. Thank you, Shaka.
Yes, that's Shaka before Whitney. Yes.
That's right.
Yes, before Whitney. Yes. Yes. You gotta be careful who you
That's right. That's right. That's right.
What you're saying about Malindy and music is making me think about the way you're talking about food in your poem. In the organic intellectual.
Right.
It's sort of the celebration.
Absolutely.
Because why would someone write a haiku about curry goat, right? But like so there's something uppity about that.
There's and these rather simple foods and elevating them to be like steak and whatever you like with steak. That this is the heart of the community in these foods that we're eating, and this is the way for me to remember my parents and my grandparents and what they did with what they had.
I'm also hearing the intertext of slavery when I'm hearing like the pig's ears, right? And a lot of those dishes, right, are the leftovers, right?
Exactly.
Right? They're the leftovers from what the slave owners didn't want. It's the refuse. And we turned around and made that high delicacy.
Like a delicacy.
Yes.
Exactly. Exactly right. Exactly right.
And so, I think for me, getting back to this, the use of uppity, the daring to be uppity, right? When being uppity could get you killed in America, right? If you were Black, right? That epithet as used by whites against Black people, right? You doing too much. You doing more than what you supposed to. You don't know your place, right?
You don't know your place.
Right.
Exactly.
And what I think is interesting, what I don't think they recognize, what they are labeling as uppity is really intellectual excellence. It's just, you are limited to think that it's confined to white people alone, right? So this irony that I'm gonna call you uppity, well, you only calling me uppity because I'm smart.
Exactly.
Right?
I mean, one of the poems that I didn't share with you all because it was a little longer. And when I wrote it because I thought, how uppity was my dad? The title of the poem is, in 1930, Daddy drove to California without benefit of the Negro Traveler's Green Book. And when I really learned about the Green Book, I said, so my father gets in a car and drives from Chicago to Los Angeles without knowing where he could eat, sleep, get gas. He's just tooling down the road. That kind of audacity is what we have to continue to celebrate. That someone would say, well, I got to get to California. That's my plan. So I got to do what I got to do, and I'll figure it out, even without the tools that later came to help us be able to move safely from place to place.
And if I can, then just to make it even current, right? And also the need to temper it, to learn how to temper it, because I mean, one could make the case that this is what's going on with Black Lives Matter, right? The police cops, right? Exactly. When we give a little extra because we know our rights, but when we get a little extra, really the goal is about making us be subjective and docile, right? And that sort of clap back, right? The defiant gestures, the side eye, right? The bold and brazen acts. I think that fuels a lot of this sort of the violence that we see.
And you can see it again, like you both were talking about language, in the interplay of language. Because I'm an attorney by training, so I'm always struck. It's the response is, well, I had to do it because he didn't obey.
Yes.
He didn't obey my order.
Yes. Yes.
Well, what about not obeying bad orders? I mean, or what about me knowing my life is in danger? So no, I did not do what you told me to do. So, but it's in the language. It's definitely in the language.
So we actually have a moderator who's been monitoring questions in the chat, and she's laughing now. But Dr. Courtney Marshall, who is also a literary scholar and scholar of Black feminism and African-American culture. Have you been noticing questions in the chat that we need to address, or you got questions or comments yourself?
Thank you so much, I've been hanging out here though. I have been reading the chat, and it's so nice to be here with y'all. I've loved Dennis and Reggie and Jerry forever, and this is very cool. So we do see some question, or at least comments. So there's someone who says that, for example, the words to the spirituals, this is Nancy Rockwell, are written in all our hearts, and in that way they are Shakespearean. The words of, say, Willie Perdomo, who's my colleague here at Phillis Exeter, carry us white folks into a world where we have never been and can never go. So that comment is kind of getting you to kind of harken back to your discussions about Shakespeare and Milton. I'm actually interested in personally, because I like to decenter white folks whenever possible. The piece, the Sanchez poem, and kind of thinking about when you started talking about you know, the Pope, and you're talking about Shakespeare and Milton, but I'm wondering, what do you do with Sanchez taking up Japanese forms, and is Signifying working in a similar, what new kind of conclusions might we come to with how African-American authors are also engaging kind of non-English, non-British, other types of traditions? So that's my own personal question, because, you know, that's just me. But yeah, that's my thing. And then someone also said that Wheatley, this is Barbara Ball, said, I was told that Wheatley knew she needed to use classic English so she could be heard and speak what needed to be said, yet temperate so she wouldn't ruffle feathers. Can you chat about that? And so again, I think that also speaks to my own question about these other traditions that that Black writers are engaging with.
Okay. I have some answers, but I don't want to dog conversation, so I'll sit in the cut for a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering if Lynn has thoughts, what does it mean for you as a Black poet to write in a Japanese form, right? And not that it's going to tell us what Sanchez is doing.
Right, yeah.
But
I mean, I think the questions were great, and I'd love to defer to the academics, which I am not. But I will say that when I heard that question about the haiku and the Tanka, for those of you in the audience who went to Scripps, I think you'll agree with me. When I went 100 years ago, it was a very Eurocentric education. And when I complained to the dean of the faculty, her response was, well, everything can't be about Africa. I said, forget Africa. Y'all ain't talking about Japan, China, South America, Canada. I mean, there's more to the world. So part of me wonders, and certainly in my case, of wanting to not even reflect anything of the European form and look to other places for influence for our work, and how might we shape our work with that influence from the East. Because to me, China, Japan, and India, it's just so obvious that they're such rich cultures. What can we learn from them and incorporate in our work?
You know what resonates with me around that response, Lynn, is it's literally a global decentering of Eurocentric.
Yes.
Of white Eurocentrism, right?
Yeah.
Right. For these traditions to have their own cultures that predate England.
Right.
That predate Europe, right?
Right.
And how they are marginalized in the psyches of whiteness.
Correct.
Right. So it seems to me that there's another political register there, right? To decenter English as the tradition, right? That there are traditions older than you.
Exactly.
And pontificating, right?
Exactly.
And they're not white.
Exactly.
Right? And so certainly there is something to be culled from that.
Right.
To revere and respect it on its own terms, for sure. But another way, at being captive or being under colonialist regimes, it strikes me as going to another, and I'm gonna play with language, and other, A-N with the capital O, to signify the otherness, to go to another, right, as a refuge, as a cultural refuge for making English do what you need it to do, I think is it's another uppity move.
It's another uppity move, definitely.
Centering, right? It's a global
definitely
of whiteness.
Definitely.
So there's that. And then someone wanted to know about other poems. I like the last two lines of On Imagination. And because when you count the syllables of each line of that poem, you recognize that every syllable is 10 lines. I mean, every line contains 10 syllables. Which means Wheatley is writing in heroic couplets.
Yeah.
Right. This is iambic pentameter. Right.
Right.
And to get my Milton fix on, right? If Milton, what makes Paradise Lost, one of the things that makes Paradise Lost so fabulous is he was bad enough to write an epic in unrhymed blank verse, right?
Makes the rest of us wonder why we're writing.
As a poetics of liberty, right? He wanted to untether modern poetry from the bondage of rhyming, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at Wheatley's poem, she's writing in heroic couplets. And then if you look at the rhyme scheme of the last two lines, they don't rhyme. So I take that as she's going Milton.
Right.
Right. And I can write a poem with heroic couplets, but I can also privilege the unrhymed scheme of Milton's epic verse. So suddenly, I think those two lines really speak out to me because that's another uppity move.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
And then for it to end, that's how the poem ends. So that's a drop the mic.
That's the drop the mic. Exactly what I was thinking. Yeah, that's the drop the mic. And really lay that path for successive generations to up the audacity scale. So when I read Neruda and try to adopt, I'm tired of being a man and try to adapt that my own way. My poem says, as it happens, I have never tired of Blackness, and just put it out there that not only, is it a good thing? I have never gotten tired of it. I've never wanted to be anything else. And that's the audacity that you get when you follow that trail from Wheatley to Sanchez to Lucille Clifton's. Every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.
Yes.
I always get the chills when I think about that line, because it's exactly right. Every single day. That Lucille Clifton poem. I think one of the most powerful poems. But this sort of uppityness, we all about the uppity today. But that's okay. But I love what you're talking about, the uppityness. I think you're right. Black, writing a haiku is uppity, right? If you think about all the things that, Black folks are supposed to do, right? And I think, and I also think about themes for English B is sort of in light of this, Hughes has to write this paper for a white reader, right? And, and trying to sort of negotiate, like, what does this white man want from me, right?
Who's grading me, by the way.
Right, who's assessing my work, who's grading my work, right? And there's something audacious in that he sort of turns it back on him, he's sort of asking, sort of really sort of, laying out the question about, like, what type of Blackness are you expecting to see in this poem, right? Is it a Blackness that is recognizable to you as the white reader, the white grader, right? Because he talks about, I like going to the movies, right? Like there's these other aspects of, I'm looking at what he says here. I like a pipe for Christmas present, or records, Bessie, Bop, or Bach. Wait a minute. Bach. What is like, Bessie? Okay, Bop. Okay, Bach. What's Bach doing in there? Right?
What's Bach doing in there?
But there's the ways in which that sort of defies the white expectation about Black expression, Black what Black people do and can enjoy, what Black people can write about, right? Because this is a poem about writing itself, right? And I feel like there's something about both you and Sanchez, saying not only it's not only about sort of looking to alternative forms, right? Forms that are older than English form, but also I'm Black and I want to write a haiku. Deal with it.
And
right? I can. I know a haiku. I feel like it kind of messes with the head, right?
Right.
It's okay if you want to write in free verse. That's all right.
I mean, that was what
write a
was so
sonnet. That's okay.
That was what was so fantastic and revelatory about Jane Cortez not using any punctuation. I had never seen anything like that in my life. And I said, well, damn, she's bold. And that was the point. That was and you had to learn how to read it, because you didn't have these directions, right?
Right.
So you had to kind of learn what are the line breaks work? How is this working? Because I don't have the traditional markers that I'm used to. So she's making you work for it. At the same time, she's laughing at you and saying, look what I can do.
Yes.
And what you just reminded me of, Lynn, is she is calling us out to perform the word.
Exactly.
Right? So tapping into our performative nature, right?
Exactly.
The grandness of our performative nature. If I'm going to remove all of the punctuational signifiers,
Right.
you figure out how to recite this poem.
Exactly.
Where do you inflect? Where do you pause for emphasis?
Right.
Where do you, so that's calling us to, you can't just read the word, you must perform and do the word.
Yeah.
And
you must pay attention.
Scriptural.
Yeah. You must pay attention. Listen to me when I'm talking to you, girl.
Yeah.
Yes. And for me, that's, you know, I guess I'm all about Sanchez right now, but for me, that's Sanchez's poem right there.
Yes.
Pay attention.
Absolutely.
Pay attention, right?
Pay attention.
Everyone begins picture.
Right.
And like,
Right.
and you read it, you're like, I can't picture that. Picture her kissing our spines and saying no to the eyes of slavery. I'm like, what does that look like?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
but she wants us to picture something that we're unaccustomed to seeing, right? That we sort of really have to look differently and think differently in order to really sort of look and see Tubman. Right? It's like it's happened on the level of form, right? It's happened on the level of imagery, it's happening on the level of syntax, right? On all these different levels, like she's not making it easy for us to see Tubman. Right?
But it's what Reggie said about creating a character that's compelling. So when you start out saying, picture a woman riding thunder on legs of slavery, you're like, damn, this is a bad system. Right?
Yes.
A woman riding thunder. Damn, I wish I'd written that. You know, I mean, so she grabs you right away, even though you kind of can't picture it, she makes you. She pulls you in immediately, which is what the best of Shakespeare does. You're just like, oh, you know, who is this Capulet? And, you know, all of that, doing what you're saying with the compelling character right out the box.
And it's all imperative voice. For me, right, these commands with the visual imagery, right? Picture, and then imagine, right? And then picture again, right?
Right.
Courtney, you have thoughts?
My church finger. You know, we have some questions. We have some great questions that I think I'll try to kind of put them all together. Where Jerry Ann asked, in your opinion, what does a non-Black audience have to learn, I believe, in order to read this poetry? And I think that speaks to a couple of questions, where one was, could you look at the last two lines of Wheatley's? Someone asked someone to talk about Dunbar's use of dialect. Someone else asked, what were some of your favorite lines? Do the panelists have any other favorite lines from the 4 poems we read for today's discussion? Could they please share and explain their resonance? And so I also, because I like to include my own interest, is you know, how, imagine you're teaching, or you're like the audience today who has this set of poems, like what needs to be in place so that we don't, as readers, as learners, elevate Wheatley, right, because of the language, but in that same way disparage Dunbar. And I love teaching Dunbar. So how do we, I guess what is the poetry? And we started to get at that when you talked about having to like look things up, and you know, someone asked a question about reading when Malindy sings, as opposed to, you know, reading it on the page, but also reciting it. I guess I'm wondering, so what are the things that need to be in place so that we don't replicate that violence, right, against these texts, and also pit writers against one another, right, so that, you know, then you get a different type of kind of canonizing going on.
So if I may, because I tend to teach a lot of this in my African American literature courses, and every course that I teach in African-American literature, I start by teaching Charles Mills, he's a philosopher, his essay, White Ignorance. And essentially what he's doing is he is decentering Cartesian thought, right? If Descartes believes I think, therefore I am, right? The uppityness to think that one person can think and be, and then dare to pronounce as truth everything else from his centered position, right? And so when we think about philosophy, anyone who's ever taken philosophy courses, it's dead white men speaking in abstractions and in dense language, right? And Mills is taking that on. How did this body of discourse come to regulate itself as truth and fact to the exclusion that there are other competing truths from other perspectives, be there racial, ethnic, gender, sexuality? And so he's working out a project of this solipsistic, this individualistic way of thinking that your white-centeredness legislates you to define truth. No, take a back seat, be open, be humble to other perspectives. And so I think if that's a foundational point for reading Black literature, to know us is you've got to step outside of, right, this mess that we've been given, right? All of us have been indoctrinated to these white frames of knowledge and knowing and thinking and mores, right? And so to be cognizant of that, place that on the back burner to imagine and begin walking empathetically in the shoes of a condition or position that's not your own. I think when you do that, that humbles you to multiple possibilities with the opportunity to learn. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing when encountering and working with Black culture and Black people, is recognizing we got our own tradition. We have our own way of doing things, right? How many different concepts of Black beauty are there among a Black people, right? Millions, right? And so to be open to that, right? And if there are millions of constructions of Black beauty and concepts of beauty, well, what does that say for any other thing that we can think, right? So I think to have that humility to think beyond yourself, you are not the center of creation, right? And so, and I think that's an avenue for tapping into understanding where other people are coming from. Black, white, brown, women, gay, straight, you know, what have you.
Thank you. Thank you for always reminding us that Blackness is limitless.
Right.
We can spend a million lifetimes and we wouldn't get one.
Yeah. I also like the line from Theme for English B where, you know, he says, yes, a part of me as I am a part of you, that's American. Here's the rub. Sometimes perhaps you don't want to be a part of me, nor do I often want to be a part of you.
Part of you, exactly, exactly. Just so you know.
Hey.
Just so you know.
Right, right.
Yes. You know, like the question, I think, you know, the question about how do you not privilege, you know, Wheatley over Dunbar. I think what's so interesting about Dunbar's poem is that, like, the not privileging of the sort of, you know, official or the sanctioned or the what is usually esteemed as within the poem itself, right? So I feel like sometimes, you know, like it's in the poem, it's in the literature itself if you take the time to read it, right? Because Miss Lucy is, you know, Miss Lucy is prim and proper. I'm sure she's real nice, right? She thoughts all her, she has all the correct, right? But she is not Malindy, right?
Right.
Right. And so, like, it's interestingly enough, I think in that poem itself, you know, and like, you know, he is actually critiquing the very thing that white forms of knowledge produces, right?
Yeah.
Right. Like he's critiquing, you know, that white music ain't nothing but lines and dots. It's lines and dots. It ain't nothing more than that. Anybody can read some lines and dots, right? But, you know, so the critique is in the work itself. You know, so I think, a lot of these authors, the work is in, like, you know, the message is in the work itself, right? The sort of critique of whiteness is in the work itself. I'm like, even in Wheatley, right? Even though she's speaking the proper English, right? You know, you know, she's speaking, you know, in the heroic couplets and the iambic pentameter, and then breaks that at the end. Like, you know, she's writing just like Pope and all the rest of those folks, right? On the in England, right? You know, for me, you know, it's, you know, the image, the ways in which she uses, you know, images of fetters and bonds and bondage, right, and being enslaved in a poem that's really about the freedom of the mind. Right. You know, like, you know, she is doing a whole lot there. Even if you could read the poem and be like, oh, look at all the classical allusions. Oh, she knows her Greek mythology. Oh, isn't it beautiful? Oh, she knows Helicon, and you know, but in all of that, right, is this critique, right, of the earthly, right? And you know, like I'm like in like, you know, if I'm going to be bound by anybody, I'm going to be bound to the imagination. Like, that's the only person I'm willing to be a servant to, be a slave.
It's the early version of free your mind and your ass will follow.
Yes, yes.
That's basically what she's saying.
All right, Parliament.
Free your mind.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know, and that shows that lineage, that however you express it, you can trace the ancestors saying these things in their circumstance. Because as I was listening to you, that's what occurred to me: free your mind and your ass will follow.
The next time I teach my African American music, I'm gonna bring Parliament Funkadelic in with Wheatley.
Well, I think that helps the young people who would say, I don't want to read Phyllis Wheatley. I don't want to read all that English stuff she's talking about. Well, okay, but think about, what is she actually doing? What is she saying? Remember, I understand you didn't live 300 years ago. Right. She's saying what we are saying today, but we say it this way, she said it that way, because she had to make her point in a way that would make people listen.
Yes. Yes.
You have to figure out, and all of us do that in all of our jobs. How do I make people hear me?
Yes.
It can be great, but if it turns them off or they don't get it or what, they're not going to hear you. So that's the job.
And how do you do it strategically?
Right.
Make your case and be gone. And by the time they figure it out, you singing hallelujahs up in the choir.
You moved on.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I love the lines from stanzas 15 and 16 of Sanchez's poem. I think the language, well, the first one, the 1 in 15, is just beautiful and sublime to me. 16 is just heroic. Picture the daylight bringing her to woods full of birth moons, right? That clearing, that something, and of course, this is her on her journey, but picture the daylight, like the daylight giving way to this woman, bringing her to the woods full of birth moons. What birth, right? The birth of freedom coming. Freedom is emerging from these women, right? And so picture that daylight, hold sacred that image. And do we think of, like, I think there's this way in which we are proud and we revere Harriet Tubman. We don't really know her, right? We haven't stopped to take the time to meditate. And I think the density of these passages, since they're not easy, they're not sing-song along, right? Not easy. You got to decode the dense concentration of symbolism. To do that is to understand Tubman in ways that go beyond lip service, right? And then stanza 16, picture John Brown, taking her hands 3 times, saying, as if she's the Holy Trinity, General Tubman, General Tubman.
And then you pair that with 23, picture this woman of royalty wearing a crown of morning air. So her shoes may be torn or whatever, but she is a queen, right? So.
Yes, and you know, and ethereally so too, right? Like I love sort of mixture. Like, you know, on one hand, she's on the earth,
right?
But her, you know, but she's also in the heavens, you know, right? I love, or in the, you know, of the air. I love the image of that. I'm gonna, you know, I guess I'm cheating. I'm gonna know the last stanza. Okay. Picture Black voices leaving behind lost tongues, right? And I think, you know, in the way in which the the final stanza moves from singular Tubman,
Mhm.
of course, and all the the densely beautiful imagery to the collective, right? That
Right,
this was really about more than Tubman,
right,
right? And
exactly.
but without Tubman, there would not be the multitude.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Um,
And there certainly wouldn't be voices, there would be silence.
Yes.
I mean, that's,
yes, yes, yes.
And
Yeah.
if I may, right, I can't help but read this poem and think about this poem and the ways that we're discussing it and see this Tubman as a metonym, right, as this overarching symbol for how Black women turned out to vote a couple of weeks ago, the role that they played, right? Stacey Abrams and the Black women who just was not going to stay at home, or if they did, they did their mail-in ballots, right?
right.
I think history is repeating through this poem
Right.
in a different way, right? So as Tubman saved many souls, look at the souls of America that the Black women who rocked the vote a couple of weeks ago saved. I think it's part of that continuum.
It's part of that continuum. There was a commercial for Biden that had Mayor Lightfoot, Stacey, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and I forget who the fourth one was. And you couldn't help but look at that and say, okay, Mr. Biden, when you get where you want to go, don't forget. And he has said, to his credit,
yes.
I have got to talk about these Black women because they had Clyburn came out and said, okay, this is the guy. And Black women said, all right, y'all, this is what we need to do.
Yes.
So it's on that continuum. We have HBCU in the White House. So that's the kind of thing you say, gee, I wish my dad was alive and my mom were alive to see it, because it seems so unattainable. But here we are. Here we are.
I see stanza 23 right there. Picture her walking, running, reviving a country's breath. Right, just to your point, both of your points there, right? That the country was dead, right? No breath, couldn't breathe.
Right.
I mean, I think the country's breath here, in light of all the stuff about Black folks breathing and not breathing.
And not breathing, exactly.
Evocative, I think, to think about here. But that this Black woman, brought breath back to, or Black women bring breath back to a country that's suffocating.
Yeah, exactly. And that was suffocating them, but still had the strength and the fortitude. Wasn't Trayvon's mother? Unfortunately, we have so many killed Black young men. I forget which of the mothers was elected to Congress.
Bath. Is it?
Yes.
Bath is her last name.
Yeah, out of Missouri.
McBath, Lucy McBath.
Lucy McBath. I mean, to say, okay, every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. I mean, that's it, right? So, and we will continue on until our last breath. So, but to know that Sanchez was saying, and if you go back and look at the history of African-American poetry, it's in there in some way.
So I absolutely hate to interrupt, but I must. This has been such a rich dialogue and conversation, and I hope folks have been enjoying this. An additional component of this poetry series, The Black Matter is Life, offers our communities across the state an opportunity to come together to create 12-line poems inspired by one of the poems selected for each of the discussions. And tonight's joy poem, Halcyon Heights, was inspired by Phyllis Wheatley's poem Imagination that we did talked a lot about tonight. Was written by Andrew Richmond, Lisa Howe, Jesse Ryan, and Mimi White. And I'm going to invite Andrew Richmond just to read that poem for us. And then we'll just do a quick discussion before we close out. Andrew Richmond is the head librarian at the Rye Public Library in New Hampshire. Andrew?
Good evening. We're very privileged to be part of this august company tonight. Thank you for having us. And we'd like to thank Rye poet Mimi White for engaging the library in this outstanding project. As you mentioned, we were inspired by Phyllis Wheatley's poem on imagination, and particularly by her muses, her language, her resistance, and her celebratory voice. Especially since the poem was written over the course of November 3rd, and particularly after November 7th. I think it might speak for itself. So, Helicon Heights. Helicon Heights she has fresh achieved. A nation awaiting now stands relieved. Most potent hands and minds attend, bringing dark hours to an end. My mental station frees the train to fly and join the mounting victory cry. Against these times that bind me to my rooms, resplendent rays reversed past gloom. Though winter waits to dull fall's radiant gold, glowing heat will banish lingering cold. Once faded fetters tarnish dimmed, now break the bands, together win. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you. Dennis, Reggie, Lynn, any comments before we close? Any closing comments, any response, anything else before we close out?
I think what immediately comes to mind for me, I just wonder if Wheatley, Dunbar, and Hughes could see us now. You know,
Exactly.
I wonder what poetic lays they would write.
Yeah. And I think that this group captured Wheatley's spirit so well with that poem. Just amazing. Just amazing.
And she's our first.
She is our first, always first in our hearts.
Yeah.
You started it all for us, so thank you
Absolutely.
so much. Thank you so much. I think that I've been given the task of closing out this program. But first, thank you to my colleague, Dr. Reginald Wilburn.
Yes,
But
sir.
thank you. But thank you so much, Lynn, for the poems you read, for the inspirational insight
Yes.
that you brought to the conversation, and helping us understand why Black poetry matters, understanding the tradition and how you think about it, and what it means to signify, because you were doing some signifying yourself. And hopefully everyone will buy many of your books, because the poetry is just gorgeous. And just thank you so much.
And I just want to take just a moment to say what a thrill it was. I don't think, well, I have been to New Hampshire once years ago, but I haven't been recently, and doesn't look like I'm coming anytime soon. So this has been a real delight, and it was my honor to join you. I could have talked the rest of the evening. So thanks again for letting me partake of it. And I'm just so excited to know that your students are getting this wealth of knowledge. It's fantastic.
Thank you. And yeah, we so enjoyed it. I so enjoyed meeting you, and hope this will not be the last time.
This will not be the last time. We're going to figure something out here. And your poet that you're having next time, I know you guys are going to talk about it. She's a buddy of mine, so we're going to figure out.
Okay.
Yeah, she's one of my BFFs. So
yeah, good.
We're going to figure something out, definitely.
We've met her before, actually, so I'm
good.
Looking forward to seeing her again.
Oh, you guys are going to have a fantastic time with her. I'm going to tune in for that one.
Okay.
Oh, great. Well,
you have a word for us.
So as we close out the program, I want to thank our sponsors. We would be remiss if we didn't do that. Tito's Handmade Vodka, Bangor Savings Bank, Women of the Sea, Trobrack Brewery, Rye Public Library, Nashua Public Library, Keene Public Library, and Black Lives Matters in Nashua. I also want to thank our volunteering staff, Gina Boker, Susan Paquin, Mimi White, Kirsten Barton, Dan Comley, Ann Romney, and Terry Robinson. And I also encourage everyone to join us on December 9th at 5 p.m. for the second in the series where the title is In Protest. We'll be featuring our guest poet, Patricia Smith. And the poets that we'll be looking at in that series is James Weldon Johnson, The Creation, Audre Lorde, Litany for Survival, Danez Smith, Dear White America, and Elizabeth Alexander, Ars Poetics, number 1002 rally. They're all on our website at blackheritagetrailnh.org. And we look forward to seeing you on the 9th, December 9th. Thank you so much for joining us.
Night.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.